Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and discovering that water no longer reaches your city. No irrigation, no deliveries, no emergency supplies. The ground cracks under relentless heat. The air burns your lungs. Nothing grows the way it should. Most of us would panic immediately. Modern food systems collapse fast when water disappears. But for the Nabataeans, this wasn't a crisis. It was everyday life. They lived in one of the driest regions on Earth. Rain was rare. Rivers vanished without warning. A single failed harvest could mean starvation. And yet, for centuries, the Nabataeans didn't starve. They fed entire communities in the heart of the desert, not through miracles, not through abundance, but through crops chosen with ruthless precision. Plants that tolerated heat, survived drought, and produced food where almost nothing else could. These weren't pretty crops. They weren't fast-growing or high-yield. They didn't rely on constant water or fertile soil. They were survival crops. Barley, known as Hordeum vulgare, was one of the most important grains in Nabataean agriculture. It is a fast-maturing cereal adapted to extreme environments. Unlike more demanding grains, barley tolerates poor soil, irregular rainfall, and intense heat. For desert societies, this mattered deeply. A crop able to complete its life cycle quickly reduced the risk of total failure when rain was scarce, late, or unpredictable. Barley's greatest advantage was resilience. It required less water than wheat and survived conditions that destroyed more delicate crops. However, its yields were modest and its flour coarse. Nabataean farmers accepted this trade-off deliberately. Barley was never chosen for refinement or prestige. It was chosen because it failed slowly. Even in bad years, it usually produced something edible, which in desert life mattered far more than high yields in rare favorable seasons. Barley was cultivated in shallow soils near terraces and runoff channels that captured brief desert rains. Over generations, farmers selected varieties that matured faster and tolerated heat better. Barley evolved alongside water harvesting systems rather than irrigation fields. Its role was foundational, not glamorous. When other crops failed or trade slowed, barley provided a basic caloric backbone that allowed Nabataean communities to endure prolonged drought and instability. Emmer wheat, known as Triticum dicocum, is one of the oldest cultivated grains in human history. Unlike modern wheat, emmer retained a tough outer husk that protected the grain from heat, insects, and drought. This trait made it suitable for desert margins. For the Nabataeans, emmer was not about fine bread. It was about durability and survival in environments where storage losses could mean famine. Emmer's main strength was protection. Its husk reduced spoilage and allowed grain to be stored for long periods before processing. This flexibility mattered in arid climates. Its limitation was labor. Emmer required more effort to thresh and produced less refined flour. Nabataean farmers accepted this cost because the alternative was worse. In the desert, ease and aesthetics mattered far less than reliability under heat, dust, and time. Emmer wheat was grown in areas with slightly deeper soil, where seasonal rains could be captured. Planting was carefully timed because there were no second chances. Once harvested, the grain could be stored safely until needed. Emmer functioned as insurance against uncertainty. When drought shortened seasons or storage conditions were harsh, emmer endured. Its continued use shows that desert agriculture favored crops that absorbed failure rather than collapsed from it. Date palms, Phoenix dactylifera, were the most important survival crop in Nabataean desert agriculture. With deep roots reaching underground moisture, date palms thrived where surface crops could not. They tolerated extreme heat and poor soil while producing large quantities of food. Dates provided dense calories, natural sugars, and minerals. In arid environments, few plants offered such dependable energy with minimal ongoing water input. Dates offered unmatched reliability once palms were established. Trees produced fruit for decades and required little daily care. Dates could be eaten fresh or dried, storing naturally for months without technology. Their main limitation was time. Palms took years to mature before producing meaningful harvests. Nabataean farmers accepted this delay because the reward was permanence, not speed, in landscapes where most crops remained temporary. Date palms were cultivated near cisterns and water harvesting systems that reduced evaporation and protected stored moisture. Farmers layered crops beneath the palms, using shade to lower soil temperature and water loss. This created small microclimates where other plants could survive. Dates were not isolated crops. They were structural pillars around which Nabataean desert agriculture was organized and sustained across generations. Over centuries, Nabataean farmers selected date varieties that tolerated heat, salinity, and drought. The palm became more than a food source. It shaped settlement patterns, trade routes, and long-term planning. Dates anchored stability in unstable environments. This is why the date palm receives more attention than any other crop. In the desert, survival favors plants that think in decades rather than seasons. Lentils, known as lens culinaris, were a vital protein source in Nabataean desert diets. Small and fast-growing, lentils completed their life cycle before extreme heat peaked. They required minimal water compared to most crops. In arid regions where animal protein was scarce and unreliable, lentils provided essential nutrition. Their value was not abundance but efficiency, turning brief moisture into lasting nourishment. Lentils tolerated drought better than many legumes and improved soil by fixing nitrogen. This benefited crops planted nearby and reduced long-term depletion. Their main limitation was yield. Lentils never produced massive harvests. Nabataean farmers accepted this because predictability mattered more than volume. Even in poor seasons, lentils usually produced something edible. That consistency made them essential in food systems designed to survive scarcity rather than depend on rare abundance. Lentils were planted in shallow soils shortly after seasonal rains. Once harvested, they dried naturally in desert heat and stored easily for long periods. Lentils thickened stews, extended grain supplies, and supported physical labor. Their cultivation required little ongoing care. In desert survival systems, small crops that consistently returned year after year mattered more than dramatic harvests that depended on perfect timing and ideal conditions. Chickpeas, known as Cicer arietinum, were especially suited to desert environments due to their deep root systems. These roots search for moisture far below the surface, allowing plants to survive extended dry spells. Chickpeas tolerated intense heat better than most legumes. For the Nabataeans, this meant reliable plant-based protein in regions where water could not be wasted on fragile or short-lived crops. Chickpeas' primary advantage was endurance. Once established, they required very little water. Their main limitation was slow early growth, which demanded careful planting and timing. However, mature plants proved extremely resilient. After harvest, chickpeas dried naturally and stored for months without spoilage. In desert life, food that preserved itself reduced labor, waste, and risk across unpredictable seasons. Nabataean farmers planted chickpeas in marginal soils where other crops struggled. Harvested peas were boiled, ground into flour, or added to stews that stretched limited supplies. Chickpeas provided dense nutrition that sustained long days of labor under extreme heat. Their cultivation reflects a central desert principle. Every crop must justify the water it consumes. Chickpeas consistently returned more nutrition than they demanded. Figs, known as Ficus carica, thrived where many fruit trees failed. Their extensive root systems accessed deep moisture, allowing survival through drought and heat. Fig trees tolerated poor soil and irregular rainfall. For the Nabataeans, figs offered rare sweetness and calories in harsh environments where fresh fruit was limited. Once established, fig trees produced reliably with minimal ongoing care. Figs' greatest strength was preservation. Once dried under the desert sun, figs became lightweight, shelf-stable food that lasted for months. Their limitation was vulnerability during early growth. Young trees required protection until roots developed fully. Once mature, figs demanded little attention. This long-term payoff fit Nabataean priorities, favoring crops that rewarded patience rather than those dependent on constant water or care. Fig trees were planted near settlements and terraces where runoff briefly collected. Dried figs boosted energy, supplemented grains, and supported travel and trade. They turned short harvest windows into long-term food security. In desert systems, fruit trees like figs were not luxuries. They were strategic investments that reduced risk and increased resilience when annual crops failed or harvests were poor. If this kind of forgotten knowledge matters to you, consider subscribing. Each week, we explore crops and systems that modern agriculture abandoned, but ancient societies depended on to survive heat, drought, and collapse. These lessons are not nostalgia. They are practical responses to fragile food systems and growing climate pressure. Understanding how survival once worked may help us prepare for what comes next. Grapes, known as Vitis vinifera, were adapted to desert margins rather than fertile valleys. Their deep roots accessed moisture far below the surface, allowing vines to endure heat and drought. Grapes thrived on slopes and terraces where water drained quickly. For the Nabataeans, grapes offered flexibility, fresh food during harvest, and concentrated calories once preserved. Grapes' greatest advantage was versatility. Fresh grapes fed people briefly, while raisins stored naturally for months without technology. Grapes could also be fermented, turning surplus into wine that lasted far longer than fresh fruit. Their limitation was sensitivity during flowering, which required careful timing. Despite this risk, their preservation potential made grapes indispensable. In desert systems, crops that could be eaten, stored, or traded dramatically reduced survival risk. Nabataean farmers trained grapevines along stone terraces that reduced erosion and trapped moisture. Over generations, they selected varieties tolerant of heat and dry air. Grapes evolved alongside water harvesting systems and trade networks. In desert life, crops that offered multiple outcomes mattered deeply. Grapes could become food, long-term storage, or valuable trade goods, increasing resilience when isolation or drought threatened local survival. Olives, known as Olea europea, were among the most resilient trees cultivated by the Nabataeans. Once established, olive trees tolerated extreme heat, rocky soil, and long droughts. Their slow growth was not a weakness. In desert environments, permanence mattered more than speed. Olives produced reliable harvests year after year, even when annual crops failed, making them central to long-term food security. Olives' greatest advantage was oil. Olive oil delivered dense calories, preserved other foods, and stored exceptionally well in hot, dry climates. The main limitation was time. Olive trees took years to mature before producing meaningful yields. Nabataean farmers accepted this delay because the payoff was stability across generations rather than quick abundance. In desert societies, patience was often the difference between survival and collapse. Olive trees were planted on hillsides and terraces where runoff could be captured without pooling. Pressed oil-powered lamps improved nutrition and stabilized diets during drought. In arid economies, fat was rare and valuable. Olives transformed marginal land into long-term security, rewarding careful planning and patience with resilience. Their role extended beyond food, anchoring both daily life and survival systems. Onions, known as allium cepa, were a practical necessity in desert agriculture. They tolerated heat and grew reliably with limited water when planted carefully. Their strong flavor masked spoilage in other foods, while their medicinal properties supported health. For the Nabataeans, onions were not luxury vegetables. They were functional crops chosen because they performed consistently under harsh conditions. Onions stored exceptionally well in dry air once cured, lasting for months without rotting. This made them ideal for bridging gaps between harvests. Their limitation was sensitivity to excess moisture, which could cause rot. In desert climates, this weakness mattered little. Dry conditions favored onions, making them a dependable component of Nabataean survival systems year after year. Nabataean farmers planted onions in well-drained soils near settlements and water channels. They added flavor, nutrients, and stability to diets dominated by grains and legumes. Onions reduced illness and improved food safety. In survival systems, crops that enhanced and protected other foods were as valuable as those that provided calories themselves. Garlic, known as Allium sativum, thrived in hot, dry climates where water was scarce. It matured quickly before peak heat and required little irrigation once established. For the Nabataeans, garlic was valued not only as food, but as protection. Its ability to strengthen the body and resist disease mattered greatly in environments where illness could be as deadly as hunger. Garlic's greatest advantage was durability. Once harvested and dried, bulbs stored for long periods without refrigeration, resisting heat and spoilage. Garlic also carried natural antimicrobial properties that reduced illness. Its limitation was yield. Garlic never produced massive volumes, but in desert survival systems, protection, longevity, and reliability mattered far more than sheer abundance. Nabataean farmers planted garlic in well-drained soils shortly after seasonal rains. It required careful spacing, but minimal water once established. Garlic flavored otherwise bland diets, helped preserve foods, and supported health during extreme conditions. In arid environments, disease could spread quickly among weakened populations. Garlic reduced that risk. Its role shows that survival crops were chosen not only to feed people, but to keep communities functional. Cucumbers, known as Cucumis sativus, may seem unlikely desert crops, but selected varieties thrived in short-growing windows. Nabataean farmers planted them where runoff briefly pooled after rare rains. Cucumbers matured quickly, transforming short bursts of moisture into edible hydration. In extreme heat, eating water mattered almost as much as drinking it, making cucumbers a seasonal but vital survival crop. The primary advantage of cucumbers was hydration. Their flesh reduced dehydration and heat stress during peak summer. Their main limitation was storage. Cucumbers spoiled quickly and could not be preserved long-term. For this reason, they were never relied on year-round. Instead, they functioned as relief crops, grown strategically to protect the body during the hottest and most dangerous weeks of desert heat. Cucumbers were planted in shaded areas near cisterns and runoff channels. They demanded precise timing, but little sustained irrigation. Consumed fresh, they cooled the body and supplemented harsher foods. In desert systems, not every crop needed to store for months. Some existed to solve immediate problems. Cucumbers existed to counter heat when it threatened survival most. Melons, known as Cucumis melo, were selected for speed and heat tolerance. Nabataean farmers favored varieties that matured quickly before moisture disappeared. Grown in low basins where rain briefly collected, melons converted short water pulses into food. In desert life, speed equaled survival. Crops that finished their cycle before drought returned were especially valuable. Melons stored water as edible food, reducing dehydration during extreme heat. Their main advantage was immediate relief rather than long-term security. Like cucumbers, melons did not store well and spoiled quickly. Nabataean farmers understood this limitation and used melons strategically. They were harvested during the most dangerous season, when heat peaked and other food sources offered little protection. Melons were planted after rains in carefully chosen basins protected from evaporation. Once harvested, they were eaten immediately or shared locally. Their value was short-term survival rather than storage. In desert agriculture, not every crop had to last. Some existed to bridge the most dangerous weeks, keeping people alive until longer-lasting foods took over again. Sesame, known as Sesamum indicum, thrived under extreme heat and drought. It required little water once established and continued growing when rainfall failed. For the Nabataeans, sesame provided something rare in desert diets: fat. Oil crops were essential in environments where calories were difficult to obtain and protein alone could not sustain long-term survival. Sesame's greatest advantage was efficiency. Its seeds produced oil that stored well and delivered dense calories. The main limitation was sensitivity during early growth, which required careful planting and timing. Once mature, sesame tolerated harsh conditions remarkably well. In desert systems, crops that converted heat into long-lasting energy were invaluable, and sesame fulfilled that role. Sesame was planted in exposed fields where few other crops survived. Nabataean farmers accepted early risk because mature plants endured drought exceptionally well. Once harvested, seeds were dried and pressed into oil that stored for long periods. Sesame transformed extreme heat into usable nourishment. In desert survival systems, that efficiency justified every drop of water invested early on. Pomegranates, known as Punica granatum, thrived on the edges of the desert. Once established, these trees tolerated heat, drought, and rocky soil with minimal care. They produced reliably even when rainfall was low. For the Nabataeans, pomegranates offered resilience rather than abundance. In environments where many fruits failed completely, pomegranates survived neglect and rewarded patience with consistent harvests. Pomegranates resisted spoilage better than most fruits due to their natural acidity. Seeds could be eaten fresh, dried, or processed into syrups that lasted months. Their main limitation was slow establishment. Trees required time before producing fruit. Nabataean farmers accepted this delay because pomegranates reduced food loss and supported health in harsh climates where preservation often mattered more than yield. Pomegranate trees were planted near terraces and runoff channels where limited moisture could be captured. Their fruit added nutrients, acidity, and variety to diets dominated by grains and legumes. In desert systems, foods that preserve themselves reduced dependence on storage technology. Pomegranates waited patiently through heat and drought, producing when conditions allowed rather than demanding constant care. Carob, known as Ceratonia siliqua, was among the most dependable tree crops in desert regions. Once established, carob trees required almost no water or maintenance. Their deep roots accessed moisture unavailable to annual crops. For the Nabataeans, carob represented long-term survival thinking. It was planted not for immediate reward, but for endurance during famine, drought, and prolonged scarcity. Carob pods were dense, naturally sweet, and extremely storable. They could be eaten directly, ground into flour, or fed to animals, supporting multiple layers of survival. Their main limitation was slow growth. Trees took years to mature. Nabataean farmers accepted this delay because carob became most valuable precisely when other food systems failed completely. Carob trees were planted on marginal land unsuitable for annual crops. Once mature, they required no irrigation or intervention, pods stored for years without spoilage, acting as famine food during collapse. In desert systems, crops that waited quietly for hard times were as important as those that fed people every season. Carob provided security when uncertainty lasted longest. These crops were not chosen for beauty, speed, or abundance. They were chosen because they tolerated heat, drought, poor soil, and neglect. Some stored water. Others stored calories. Some waited underground. Others waited on trees. Together, they formed a food system designed to absorb failure rather than collapse under it. Survival came from resilience, not optimization. The Nabataeans did not conquer the desert. They listened to it. They planted crops that matched its limits and built food systems that assumed scarcity, not abundance. In a world facing rising heat and fragile supply chains, their lesson remains clear. Survival does not belong to the most advanced societies, but to those who choose plants that refuse to fail.